Hello, my dear students. Hope you are all doing great. Today we will talk about the most important or one of the most important parts or organelles in any cell, which is the cell membrane. We all know that the cell membrane is the elastic outer covering that covers both the plant and animal cells. So let's start. Our key concept is the cell membrane is a barrier that separates a cell from the external environment. We have two main ideas. Number one, the cell membranes are composed of two phospholipid layers, and we will study them in detail. Number two, chemical signals are transmitted across the cell membrane. Let's start. We will start by the key concept, which is cell membranes are composed of two phospholipid layers. The cell membrane or the plasma membrane, sometimes you will find it named as plasma membrane. So the cell membrane or the plasma membrane forms a boundary between a cell and the outside environment, and it controls the passage of materials into and out of the cell. The cell membrane consists of a double layer of phospholipids interspersed with a variety of other molecules. Okay, a phospholipid molecule is a molecule that composed of three basic parts. Number one, a charged phosphate group. Number two, glycerol. Then number three, two fatty acid chains. So this is the head. The head consists of the charged phosphate group and the glycerol, while the tail is two fatty acid chains arranged as you can see in this picture. The heads are to the outside and the inside, and in between we have fatty acid chains. Okay, together the glycerol and the phosphate groups form the head of the phospholipid, while the fatty acids form the tail. The head is polar because it bears a charge. Do you remember the charged phosphate group? This is the reason why the head is polar. Keep in your mind that water molecules are also polar. So the polar heads of the phospholipid are or form hydrogen bonds with the water molecules. In contrast, the fatty acid tails, they are non-polar, so they will try to get away from the water. They are hydrophobic. In contrast, the fatty acid tails are nonpolar and they cannot form hydrogen bonds with water. As a result, the nonpolar tails are attracted to each other and repelled by the water. The properties of polar heads and nonpolar tails cause the phospholipids to arrange themselves in layers like a sandwich. Imagine that you have a sandwich, you have the outer layer and the upper one and the lower one. These are the bread, and in between there is the filling. So because the membrane touches the cytoplasm inside the cell and the watery fluid outside the cell, and we already know that the most part of the cytoplasm or the cytoplasm consists mainly of water, so it will also repel the fatty acid tails. The polar heads are like the bread. The polar heads form the outer surfaces of the membrane where they interact with the watery environment both outside and inside the cell, while the nonpolar tails, they are like the filling. The nonpolar tails are sandwiched between the layers of polar heads up and down, where they are protected from the watery environment, just like this one. Okay? Other molecules embedded within the phospholipid layers. Let's see. These molecules give the membrane properties and the characteristics it wouldn't otherwise have. So there are some molecules that are attached or embedded within the membrane that give the membrane a special characteristics. Like what? These molecules serve diverse functions. Number one, cholesterol. We have cholesterol, molecules that strengthen the cell membrane. Number two, some proteins extend through one or both the phospholipid layers and help materials across the membrane. Other proteins are key components of the cytoskeleton. Different types have different cell types have different membrane proteins. Okay. Then the third type of molecules that I can find in the cell membrane or within the cell membrane, these are carbohydrates, are attached to the membrane proteins and serve as identification tags. So this is for identifying the cell, enabling the cell to distinguish one cell type from another. This is the cell membrane. These are the phospholipid molecules. The heads apparently they are to the outside and the inside of the cell, while the fatty acid chains or the tail, this is in between. And we have proteins attached to one layer or both the layers of the cell membrane. Also, we have the cholesterol, because cholesterol, this is like fats. These are non-polar, so they are attracted to the tails. And we also have the carbohydrate chains that act as identification tags to the outside. Then we move to a model that is used to understand how the cell membrane works. This is the fluid mosaic model. Scientists have developed the fluid mosaic model, which describes the arrangement of the molecules that make up the cell membrane. This model of cell membrane structure takes its name from two characteristics. The first one, the cell membrane is flexible and not rigid. So it is elastic and flexible. The phospholipids in each layer can move from side to side and slide past each other, so they can change their place without making any harm or without affecting the cell membrane as a whole. As a result, the membrane behaves like a fluid. Imagine that you have a bathtub filled with water and you are moving your hand inside the water. So the water comes around your hand, then your hand keeps moving without harming the water in the bathtub. This is the same. As a result, the membrane behaves like a fluid, similar to a film of oil on the surface of the water. Okay. However, proteins embedded in the membrane do not flip vertically, so they cannot flip vertically. If one part of a protein is outside the membrane, it will remain outside the membrane. The second, the variety of molecules studding the membrane is similar to the arrangement of colorful tiles with different textures and patterns that make up the dynamic mosaic. Then we move to another part or another characteristic of the cell membrane, which is selective permeability. Permeability means allowing substances to pass through. Selective means it selects or it controls what to pass and what would not pass. So the cell membrane has the property of selective permeability. Selective permeability, which means it allows some but not all the materials to cross. As you can see here, we have some particles. These are the blue ones and the orange ones, but inside the cell, only the blue ones are allowed to pass. This is just for example, and this is the arrangement of phospholipids in the cell membrane. The terms semi-permeable and selectively permeable are also referred to this property, which is selective permeability. Okay, as an example, outdoor clothing is often made of a semi-permeable fabric. The material is waterproof but yet breathable. The molecules of water vapor from your sweat are small enough to exit the fabric, but the water droplets of rain are too large to enter. Selective permeability enables a cell to maintain homeostasis, a stable internal environment, in spite of unpredictable changing conditions outside the cell. How? The cell must control the import and export of certain molecules and ions because a cell needs to maintain certain conditions to carry out the functions. Even if ion concentration change drastically outside the cell, these ions won't necessarily interfere with vital chemical interactions inside the cell. This is maintaining the homeostasis, maintaining a stable internal environment inside the cell to allow the cell to live its life, to do its life processes and life functions. Even if there is a drastically change outside the cell in any concentration of ions, the selective permeability of the cell membrane allows the cell to control the import and export of these molecules, to know what to get and what to keep outside the cell or get out from the cell. Okay, molecules cross the membrane in several ways. Some of these methods require the cell to expend energy, others do not. How a particular molecule crosses the membrane depends on the molecule size, its polarity, and concentration inside versus the outside of the cell. In general, small nonpolar molecules easily pass through the cell membrane. Small nonpolar molecules easily pass through the cell membrane, while the small polar molecules are transported via proteins. Okay, the large molecules, they are moved in vesicles. Okay, chemical signals are transmitted across the cell membrane. Keep in your mind that the cell membranes may secrete means produce molecules and may contain identification or identifying molecules such as carbohydrates. All these molecules can act as signals to communicate with other cells. How are these signals recognized? Let's see. A receptor is a protein that detects a signal molecule. You remember the identification tags? So a receptor is a protein that detects a signal molecule and performs an action in response. A receptor recognizes and binds to only certain molecules. Do you remember the enzymes? Ensuring that the right cell gets the right signal at the right time. The molecule that a receptor binds to is called a ligand. So each receptor binds to a special ligand. When a receptor and a ligand bind, they change the shape. Then this change in shape is critical because it affects how a receptor interacts with other molecules. Two major types of receptors are present in your cells. They are found in the cell membrane, or they are found in our cells. One is named intracellular receptor, while the other is named membrane receptor. Intracellular means within the cell or inside the cell. As you can see from the picture, this is the receptor. The large one is the receptor, and this is the molecule that the receptor will bind to, and we give them the name ligand. A molecule may cross the cell membrane and bind to an intracellular receptor. We said that intra means within the cell. Okay, molecules that cross the membrane are generally non-polar and may be relatively small. Many hormones fit in this category, so many hormones are non-polar and they are relatively small. For example, aldosterone. Aldosterone can cross most cell membranes. However, aldosterone produces an effect only in the cells that have the right type of receptor, which is kidney cells. In this case, what would happen? When aldosterone enters a kidney cell, it binds to an intracellular receptor. The receptor ligand complex enters the nucleus and interacts with the DNA and it turns on certain genes. As a result, specific proteins are made that help the kidneys absorb the sodium ions and retain water, both of which are important for making the normal blood pressure. Yes, the concentration of sodium ions and water in the body, this controls the blood pressure of the body. The second receptor is the membrane receptor. So this receptor is embedded within the membrane. Do you remember the ligand? It was outside the cell. The receptor, the other intracellular receptor, this is inside the cell. But this one is embedded within the cell membrane. A molecule that cannot cross the membrane may bind to a receptor in the cell membrane. In this case, the receptor then sends the message to the cell interior. So it gives it the message to the inside of the cell. Although the receptor binds to a signal molecule outside the cell, the entire receptor changes, even the part inside. Look, this is the receptor. When it binds to a ligand outside the cell, all the receptor changes, even the part inside the cell. As a result, it causes molecules inside the cell to respond according to this change. These molecules in turn start a complicated chain of events inside the cell that tells the cell what to do, what is the action to take. For instance, band 3 protein, this is a membrane receptor in the red blood cells. When the band 3 protein is activated, it triggers processes that carry carbon dioxide from the body tissues to our lungs. Okay, and this is another picture showing us how the cell membrane looks like with all the proteins, cholesterol, and carbohydrate chains, and also the arrangement of the phospholipids head and tails. I hope you enjoyed this episode. See you in the next one. Thank you and goodbye.